I don't know whose time she is on.
Thank you very much. I now recognize myself to ask questions, and I want to thank the committee chairman, Bast, and ranking member of this committee for holding today's hearing. And I want to thank you, Kari, Ms. Lake, for joining us today as we work to reform USAGM to its intended purpose as a national security tool. And I know some of my colleagues have already mentioned this as well, but these past few days, the world has been watching the Israel-Iran conflict. And as Iranian audiences are desperate for critical information, the digital content from VOA's Radio Farda has surged with noteworthy spikes in viewership. Meanwhile, North Korea's state-run newspaper, the Nodong Shinmun, condemned the United States for the recent U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. Without reporting from the outside world through VOA and RFA, most North Korean civilians only see the United States as the bad guy who, with no factual background or understanding of the risk of the nuclear development. So I worry about the US government's ability to win in the information domain during the next crisis, which could be just around the corner. For example, Taiwan Strait crisis, is the United States able to rapidly disseminate information and counter Chinese disinformation without entities like RFA, who have had a long-standing and unique presence in the region? I acknowledge that we need accountability and transparency within USAGM and among the grantee organizations, but we need to accomplish this with measured congressional review and reform that does not unintentionally cede ground to our adversaries. So let me ask you first line of questioning related to the retaining the critical functions of VOA. With the recent events in the Middle East, we saw a last-minute scramble to bring back VOA Farsi-speaking staff who are on administrative leave. Meanwhile, dramatic cuts to RFE, RL, Radio Liberty have crippled the Persian language service to Radio Farda. The USAGM reorganization terminated over 1,400 positions at Voice of America and spurred massive layoffs at the grantee organizations. So did you and your team have any concerns about how these terminations would severely limit the US government's ability to support the flow of accurate information abroad? Could you explain why or why not?
I don't think it will limit our ability to tell America's story abroad. And we are doing that. And you said scrambled to bring people in. I wouldn't say scramble. I think when breaking news happens, if you've been in a newsroom, you get, there's a much, you could call it scrambling if you choose, but basically when breaking news happens, it's all hands on deck. And these professionals came back in and they're still with us and they're still employed. And they got to work as you do in a newsroom, especially when news happens and it's not at their normal time where they would normally be in. You come into the newsroom and you cover the story, and that's what we're gonna do. We can do it with a smaller staff. This newsroom should have been downsized a long time ago, but because it's the federal government and they don't believe in downsizing at all, it hasn't happened. Too many people were working in the newsroom, and we've shrunk that down in order to meet the president's statutory his requirement to bring it down to statutory minimum.
Okay, let me get to the next line of questioning regarding the grantees then. The RFA has been vital in countering the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, whether it was exposing the CCP's ridiculous attempts to blame the US for the COVID-19 pandemic or uncovering the Uyghur genocide to the world that left RFA Uyghur service reporters and their families vulnerable to CCP harassment. USAGM's journalists have spent decades building credibility and trust with audiences that have grown dramatically in recent decades. With the reorganization, however, the grantees have had to let go of a significant portion of their employees and are unable to effectively fulfill their mission. So what strategy can you explain to us do you have in place to ensure we preserve the respective missions, the talents, the functions, and on-the-ground expertise of the grantee organizations?
Well, a lot of what the grantees are doing was duplicitous of what we're doing at VOA. Why do we need RFA to be doing a Mandarin news service when we at VOA are doing Mandarin? Why do we need to have taxpayers pay for that? And also, we don't have a grant agreement, a current grant agreement. We're working to get one, and they have not been cooperative. You know, the grant agreement that was in place, that the Biden administration put in place with these folks, had no transparency. And we don't have a current approved financial plan from these grantees either. And then they choose to sue us. They choose to sue us in the middle of this.
My understanding, the VOA operation is pretty much gone.
No, it's not
no
gone.
People there.
We're doing what is statutorily required, the statutory minimum. President Trump put forth in his executive order to bring this agency to its statutory minimum functions. And Mandarin happens to be one of those statutorily required languages. And we have a staff, I believe we have about 15 people we will be staffing for our Mandarin coverage. And you mentioned if something were to happen, a big news story were to break, we would surge people over. This is how newsrooms operate. For example, in an American newsroom, when the elections happen, you surge people in to cover, you put more reporters on covering the elections because it's a big story. And then when there aren't elections, you have fewer people covering elections. When there's an earthquake, you surge people over. We have pulled back $17.3 million from the grantees. We're going to use that money to surge operations for news coverage when need be.
Well, I agree that we have to have efficient operations, but the point that I'm trying to make is that we have let go of journalists that have spent decades building their credibility and trust with our audiences that are listening and relying on RFA, RFE, RL. I just want to make sure that those talents are not eliminated, and we are able to bring them back as soon as possible. And again,
well, we're paying
Go
RFA.
on.
We've paid them. I mean, I don't know what they're doing with their money. I do know they're suing us with their money. I'm not sure what they're doing. We're paying RFA, and if they're firing their workers, then that's on them. But this agency spends $950 million. $400 million is going to these grantees, and we've paid them.
In the interest of time, I know we're way over time. I do want to recognize Mr. Johnson, Rep. Johnson from Texas. Ms. Johnson, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity, Ms. Lake.
Hi.